Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I tell real stories from Thailand. Some come from emails you send me, others come from people I meet while living here. These stories are real. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're painful, but they all show what life out here is really like for foreigners who come chasing peace, adventure, or love. If you are watching this, subscribe to this channel. They might save you money, freedom, or even your life if you are thinking about moving to Thailand for a fresh start. Without further ado, let's begin. I am writing this email because I want people to understand what really happened to me in Thailand, and I want your viewers to hear it straight from the person who lived it. My name is Peter Lawson. I am from Newcastle in Australia, and I moved to Thailand believing that a fresh start would fix the loneliness that had been sitting in my life for far too long. I found your channel after a friend showed me one of your videos, and I felt like my story had a place here. I am not sharing this for sympathy. I am sharing it because I want people to stop making the same mistakes I made. I want people to think twice before trusting their own desperation. This is my own account, told in my own words, and you can use it in your video exactly like this. I was 62 years old when I decided to leave Australia. I had spent more than 30 years working in commercial refrigeration. The job was decent, but my personal life fell apart after my marriage ended in a very bitter divorce. My ex-wife left, my 2 adult children barely spoke to me anymore, and my confidence just kept shrinking. I spent too many nights sitting in my small apartment drinking cheap beer and scrolling through travel forums where people talked about starting fresh in warmer places. I read post after post about Thailand, about cheap living, about friendly people, about men who felt reborn after moving there. After almost a year of thinking about it, I sold most of my belongings and bought a one-way ticket to Chiang Mai. I chose Chiang Mai because everyone online said it was quieter than Bangkok, but still lively enough for foreigners. I told myself that I would rent a small room, stretch my pension, eat simple food, and maybe find companionship that did not feel forced. When I landed there in February of 2022, it felt like stepping into a different version of life. The warm air felt good after so many years in cold workshops. The mountains looked peaceful. The night markets made me feel like the world had color again. For the first month, everything went exactly how the online forums promised. I rented a small studio near the old city. I ate street food every day. I tried to speak basic Thai phrases. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I did not feel like the lonely divorced man back home. I felt like someone with a new chapter ahead. I wish the story ended there, but that is not how life works when you carry unresolved loneliness into a new country. I met a woman named Molly at a cafe near Tha Phai Gate. She worked the morning shift, making coffee and cleaning tables. I noticed her because she was always polite, and she made an effort to talk to customers. She did not use a sweet tone or flirt like some women around the tourist areas. She just talked to me like a normal person, and after months of feeling invisible, that felt incredible. After a week of small talk, she asked where I was from, and I told her about Australia and about how I came to Thailand to start fresh. She told me she was a single mother with a 13-year-old son, and she worked long hours to keep things stable. She did not ask for money. She did not push for anything. She just talked, and that was enough for me. Soon, we started seeing each other outside the cafe. We met at night markets, walked around the old temples, and ate cheap meals together. She invited me to her apartment after a month, and I met her son. He was shy but polite. Everything felt real. Everything felt possible. When she asked me if I wanted to move in with her, I agreed immediately. I thought I finally had a partner who cared about me without conditions. I thought this was the life I had been searching for. What I did not realize at the time was how much of my judgment was based on the fear of being alone again. I kept telling myself that she was different, that she was not like the warning stories other foreigners shared in bars. I convinced myself that our relationship was genuine because I needed that to be true. I ignored the signs that would have been obvious if I had been thinking clearly. I told myself that I deserved happiness and that this was my chance to rebuild my life from the ground up. After a while, she started talking about her dream of owning her own cafe. She said she wanted to stop working for other people and create something stable for her son. She showed me small, empty shop fronts around Chiang Mai and talked about how she could make them successful if she only had enough money for equipment and renovations. I wanted to help her. I wanted to be part of a project that felt like a future. I had savings from selling my belongings in Australia, and I convinced myself that helping her open a cafe was an investment in both of us. Looking back, this is where everything started to go wrong. At the time, it felt like a good decision. At the time, it felt like building a life. I did not think about legal protections. I did not think about paperwork. I trusted her completely. She said she would handle the documents because she spoke Thai and knew the process. I agreed, without asking questions. I handed over money little by little, thinking that teamwork meant trust. I did not realize that the shop was never going to belong to me, not even partially. I want to continue my story from where things began to shift. Once Molly and I started preparing for her cafe, my life in Chiang Mai became entirely centered around that project. I woke up thinking about it, spent the afternoons inspecting equipment or meeting vendors, and in the evenings I listened to her talk about her plans. I thought we were building something that belonged to both of us. I never questioned her control over the paperwork because I kept telling myself that she knew the language and the local system better than I ever could. I felt like challenging her would mean I did not trust her, and trust was the only thing I thought I had to hold on to. I paid for a commercial-grade coffee machine, a refrigerator, new tables made from reclaimed wood, custom chairs, 2 ceiling fans, a small air conditioner, and decorative lights. I also covered the cost of repainting the place, installing new shelves, and buying uniforms. Every time I paid for something, she would thank me and tell me that we were creating a future together. She would say that the cafe would support us both and help her son grow up with stability. I believed every word. The expenses kept adding up. I kept telling myself that investments always start like this. I had never owned a business before, but I convinced myself that losing money at the beginning was normal. I remember checking my bank account one morning and seeing a number lower than what I was used to. Instead of worrying, I told myself that once the cafe opened, I could relax. I told myself that I would regain everything through the business. That was how blind I had become to my own fear of loneliness. The cafe opened in September of 2022. We had bought supplies, hired 1 part-time worker, and printed a menu that Molly designed herself. She asked me to avoid being too visible at the shop because she said customers would feel uncomfortable if they thought it was a foreign-owned business. She said locals preferred local places. That seemed logical, so I mostly stayed in the background. I felt proud every time I walked past and saw people inside. I thought everything was finally falling into place. The truth is that the customers never came in the numbers we needed. The shop sat in a quiet neighborhood where tourist traffic was rare. Local people would come in, order the cheapest drink, and sit for hours using the free Wi-Fi. The part-time worker quit within a month because the salary was too low for the hours Molly demanded. I kept offering to help, but she insisted that she needed to run things her way because she had experience. When she said she needed more money for advertising, I paid. When she said she needed new glassware and better chairs, I paid again. At this point, I was already deeply tied to the business. I had spent more money than I ever intended, but I told myself that stopping now would mean all the effort had been wasted. Instead of facing the truth, I kept hoping the next week would be different. Molly became more stressed, but instead of talking to me the way she used to, she became distant. She went out after closing the shop without telling me where she was going. When I asked her if something was wrong, she would say she was tired and did not want to talk. I believed I was the one making things difficult, so I stopped asking questions. Around this time, my pension payments were unexpectedly delayed due to a processing issue back in Australia. It was the first time anything like that had ever happened. I thought it would take a week to fix, but it took more than a month. I suddenly found myself with limited cash. I told Molly about the delay, expecting support, but instead, she looked annoyed. She asked how the cafe was supposed to run without more money. She said that without upgrades and constant improvements, we would lose customers. I told her we needed to slow down and control expenses, and her response was cold. She said I was thinking small and did not understand business. That conversation made me feel like I was responsible for the business failing. I carried that guilt and tried to hide the stress. I became afraid to look at my remaining savings. I became afraid to tell anyone what was happening. I did not want to admit that the life I believed I was building might collapse. My own denial was stronger than common sense. Molly began coming home at irregular hours. Sometimes she did not come home at all. She stopped answering my messages. She stopped including me in decisions about the cafe. I still paid for supplies because I was too embarrassed to admit that I had run out of extra money. I wanted to believe she was just overwhelmed. I wanted to believe that everything would get better once my pension resumed. I could not accept the thought that I had made a massive mistake. One morning I walked to the cafe and found the door locked. The lights were off and the sign had been taken down. The neighbor told me the landlord had been angry about unpaid rent. When I tried calling Molly, her phone went straight to voicemail. I checked the cafe bank account, which she controlled, and everything was empty. I did not even have access to the documents because she kept them in a folder at her place. When I went back to the apartment, she and her son were gone. Her clothes were gone. The furniture she owned was gone. Only my suitcase and a few shirts were left. I tried reporting the situation, but since everything was legally in her name, there was nothing I could do. I remember sitting in that empty room, staring at the walls, feeling like the air had been punched out of me. I did not know how to pay next month's rent. I did not know how to survive without my pension. I did not know anyone well enough to ask for help. That was the moment I realized I had lost everything. After Molly disappeared and the cafe shut down, I went through a period that felt unreal. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle anything, even after the divorce, even after losing contact with my kids. But nothing prepared me for what it felt like to be abandoned in a foreign country with almost no money and no support. I had enough cash for about 2 weeks of rent, and after that, I was fully exposed. I remember sitting in the empty apartment, trying to make a plan, but my mind was not working clearly. It felt like everything I had built in the past 60+ years had been erased. I kept blaming myself instead of facing the situation logically. The first week after she left, I stayed inside the room most of the time. I did not want to go outside because I felt ashamed. I kept telling myself that everything could be fixed if I waited. I convinced myself that Molly might come back, or maybe there had been a misunderstanding. I even sent her a few messages asking if she was safe or if something had happened. Deep down, I already knew she had chosen to leave. I just refused to accept it because accepting it meant admitting I had been taken advantage of. I had spent so long trying to build a new identity in Thailand that I did not know who I was once that dream collapsed. When the rent came due, I could not pay it. I contacted the landlord and tried to explain the situation, but he did not want excuses. He told me he had heard similar stories from other foreigners who got involved with local partners. He said he was sorry, but he needed the room for someone who could actually pay. I packed the few things I had left, which was mostly clothes and a small bag with documents. I did not even have the cafe receipts or contract copies because Molly kept all that. By the end of that day, I was officially homeless in Chiang Mai. The first night, I stayed in a cheap guest house using the last bit of cash I had. It was a small room with a mattress on the floor and a fan that barely worked. I did not sleep much. I kept staring at the ceiling, thinking about how quickly everything had fallen apart. By the next morning, I had to check out because I could not afford another night. I walked around the city feeling like I was floating outside my own life. I remember sitting on a bench near the moat, watching tourists take pictures and laugh, and I thought to myself that I looked just like any other expat sitting there, but I was completely empty inside. I tried looking for help, but I did not know where to start. Some foreigners go to the embassy, but I was too embarrassed to walk in there and say that I had thrown away my savings on a cafe and a relationship. I kept thinking that they would judge me. I also thought about contacting my children, but I had not spoken to them properly in years. I felt like I had no right to ask them for anything. During that period, I survived by staying in 24-hour places, like train stations and bus stops. Some nights I found empty chairs in shopping centers and pretended I was waiting for someone. Other nights I walked around until I could not keep my eyes open anymore. I kept my small bag close because it was all I had left. I started skipping meals to make what little money I had last. Eventually, I ran out completely. I did not realize how vulnerable I had become until one night when I fell asleep behind a market stall and woke up to find my bag missing. Someone had stolen everything: my clothes, my documents, my phone, and the last bit of cash I had hidden inside the bag. In that moment, I felt a wave of panic hit me because I did not know how to move forward without identification or a way to contact anyone. I remember walking through the market looking for the bag even though I knew it would never show up again. That was the lowest point of my life. I went several days without proper food, just drinking water from convenience stores and eating whatever cheap snacks I could find or whatever someone offered me. I became weak and dizzy. I did not recognize the person I had become. I had gone from a man trying to start a new chapter to someone living in alleys. People walked past me without even looking. I realized that the dream of Thailand being a paradise was something I had created in my own head. The country did not harm me. My own choices did. Eventually, an old expat I had met months earlier recognized me. His name was Chris, and he had seen me a few times at bars and local gatherings. He looked shocked when he saw the state I was in. He took me to a small restaurant and bought me a proper meal. I remember eating slowly because my stomach could not handle normal food anymore. He asked what had happened and I told him everything, all of it, from the beginning to the end. He did not judge me. He said he had seen many men go through similar situations. He told me plainly that the only way forward was to contact my family because I had no resources and no documents left. I resisted the idea at first. I told him I could figure something out. I told him I did not want to bother anyone back home. But he insisted that survival mattered more than pride. He gave me an old phone and enough money to get a prepaid card. He told me he would check on me again the next day. That small act of kindness is what shifted everything. That night, I sat outside the guest house he paid for and stared at the phone. My hands were shaking because I knew exactly who I needed to call, and I knew that the call would force me to confront the truth about my life. I dialed my daughter's number and waited. When she answered, I almost hung up because I felt overwhelmed. I told her it was me and that I needed help. She went silent for a moment, and then she asked where I was and what had happened. I told her the entire story without trying to hide anything. She told me she would help me return home, and that was the first moment in months where I felt relief. After my daughter agreed to help me return to Australia, the next challenge was figuring out how to get my documents in order. Losing my bag meant I had no passport, no identification, and no way to prove who I was. I did not realize how serious that was until I tried walking into the Australian consulate in Chiang Mai and explained my situation. They did not judge me, but they made it clear that I needed to provide proof of identity and that the process would take time. They asked for phone numbers of family members who could confirm my information. They also asked for any older documents or email accounts I could access. Since Chris had given me a phone, I used my email to dig up old, scanned copies of paperwork. Without those, the process would have taken much longer. My daughter coordinated with them and verified everything they needed. She sent copies of her own identification and confirmed our relationship. The consulate staff told me that a temporary passport could be issued, but I had to wait for several days while they processed everything. That period felt like another test of patience. I stayed at the cheap guest house Chris had arranged for me, and he insisted on paying for it until my daughter sent money for me directly. I felt guilty, but he told me that if I had been in the same position years earlier and someone else needed help, I would have done the same. I did not argue. I did not have the energy to argue. During those days, I had a lot of time to think. I thought about my marriage, my divorce, my children, and all the decisions that brought me to Thailand. I realized that loneliness had been steering my life long before I stepped foot in Chiang Mai. I'd been making emotional decisions for years without seeing the bigger picture. When I moved to Thailand, I was not looking for a fresh start. I was looking for an escape. I wanted to run from the feeling of being disconnected from my family and my past. That made me vulnerable in a way I never admitted. I thought about Molly a lot, but not in the way people might expect. I did not sit there hating her. I tried to understand how the situation became what it was. I do not excuse what she did. She took advantage of trust, and she left me with nothing. But I also know that I made it easy for her to do that. I handed over money without asking questions. I transferred control of the business without reading a single document. I ignored every warning sign because I needed the relationship to work. I created a version of her in my head that did not match reality. That was my mistake. When the consulate finally issued the temporary passport, I felt a weight lift off my chest. My daughter arranged a flight and sent the money straight to the airline. She told me she wanted me home and safe, and she said we could talk about everything else later. I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. I had spent years distancing myself from my family, only to rely on them completely at the lowest moment of my life. It made me realize how stubborn I had been about keeping pride intact. Pride had never truly protected me. It had only kept me isolated. The day I left Thailand, I arrived at Chiang Mai International Airport early. I had a small plastic bag with a few items I owned, no luggage, no souvenirs, no evidence that I had ever lived there except for the memories in my head. When I stood in line for check-in, I felt like everyone could see through me. I felt like I had a sign hanging around my neck that said failed expat. I knew no one was actually looking at me, but the shame was heavy. When the plane took off, I stared out the window and watched the mountains shrink. I tried to process everything. Thailand had not been cruel to me. The people had been mostly kind. The problem had been the fantasy I built around the idea of a new life. I had convinced myself that a change in scenery could solve deeply rooted emotional problems. It cannot. Moving to another country does not erase loneliness, insecurity, or unresolved pain. All it does is relocate them. If you do not deal with your own issues, they grow even larger once you are isolated from the environment you understand. When I landed in Sydney, my daughter was waiting for me. I had not seen her in person for more than 5 years. She looked older, more mature, and more sure of herself. She hugged me and told me she was glad I was alive. I did not expect that level of emotion, and it broke me. I cried right there in the airport like a child. I kept apologizing to her for disappearing from her life and for ending up in such a disastrous situation. She told me to stop apologizing and focus on rebuilding. She took me to a small room she had arranged for me to rent. It was nothing fancy, just a clean space with a bed and a small table, but it felt safer than anything I had experienced in months. She helped me get new identification documents and helped me contact government offices to reinstate my pension. It took time, but eventually it all came through. In that quiet room, I began to rebuild my life in a slower, steadier way. I went on long walks. I stayed off social media for a while. I avoided any websites that talked about starting over in paradise. I realized that my life had been driven by the desire to escape reality rather than face it. I had chased the idea of companionship so desperately that I ignored basic self-protection. As I settled back into life in Australia, I opened up to my daughter about things I had never discussed before. We talked about the divorce, the distance between us, and the guilt I had carried for years. She told me she just wanted me to be present. That conversation was more healing than anything I experienced in Thailand. Settling back into life in Australia took longer than I expected. Physically, I was safe, but mentally, I felt like I was still sitting on that bench in Chiang Mai watching everything fall apart. I woke up many nights thinking about the cafe, about Molly disappearing, about the moment I realized I was completely out of money. Those memories attached themselves to me in a way I had never experienced. It took months before I could go a full day without replaying the events in my head. I had to learn how to function again, and that process was slow. After a few weeks in the rented room, I realized how disconnected I had become from normal structure. In Thailand, I had no routine by the end. I woke up at random hours, wandered around the city, and lived one uncertain day at a time. Back in Australia, I had to teach myself simple habits again. I forced myself to wake up early, drink water, go for a walk, and follow a schedule. These basic steps helped stabilize my mind. For a long time, I had lived reactively, letting situations control me. Now I was trying to put myself back in charge. My daughter checked on me regularly. She helped me get my pension restored, and once that happened, I finally felt like I had something solid beneath me. She encouraged me to start talking with her brother again, my son, who I had not spoken to in even longer. I was embarrassed, but I swallowed my pride and sent him a message. To my surprise, he replied the same day. He was direct, but he was not cruel. He said he was glad I was safe and that we could talk when I was ready. That small interaction meant a lot to me. I also reached out to a few old friends from my working days. I had ignored many of them for years because I was ashamed of my divorce and the loneliness that followed. This time, I explained a small part of what happened. Not the full story, but enough for them to understand why I had disappeared. Some of them invited me for coffee, and sitting with people who knew me before Thailand felt grounding. They did not pity me. They talked to me like I was still the same person, which helped me see that I was not defined by the mistakes I made overseas. During this time, I did a lot of thinking about relationships. In Thailand, I had believed that Molly offered me genuine companionship. I thought her interest in me was emotional, not practical. Now that I looked at everything with distance, I could clearly see how my vulnerability had shaped the entire situation. She did not force me to invest money. She did not force me to move in with her. I made those choices because I wanted to fill the empty space in my life. I wanted to feel needed. I wanted to feel like I was part of something again. That desire overshadowed logical thinking. I joined a small support group for older men who had gone through similar experiences, not necessarily in Thailand, but in different parts of the world. Listening to them made me realize my story was not unique. Many men who feel isolated or disconnected fall into situations where affection becomes a tool rather than a genuine bond. I do not say this to portray myself as a victim. I say it because recognizing the pattern helped me rebuild. When I understood that loneliness played a bigger role than anything else, I could finally address it honestly. I began working on rebuilding my confidence slowly. I started volunteering at a community garden near my rented room. It gave me a place to be, people to talk to, and activities that kept my mind occupied. I realized that part of what pushed me to Thailand was the lack of purpose I felt after retiring. I had gone from a structured job to empty days, and I filled that void with fantasies about a new life. Working in the garden reminded me that small responsibilities can create stability. I also met other retirees who understood the emotional challenges of stepping away from a career. They told me that retirement can feel like falling off a cliff if you do not have a plan for your time. I listened carefully because I knew that if I did not develop a stable routine, I might end up chasing another escape in the future. I wanted to change my behavior, not just change my environment. Over the months, I also tried to reconnect with my children in a deeper way. My daughter opened up about the frustration she felt when I had slowly drifted out of her life after the divorce. I explained that I had never meant to disappear, but I did not know how to be present when everything felt broken. Those conversations were uncomfortable, but necessary. We both acknowledged the mistakes we made and agreed to rebuild our relationship step by step. My son was slower to engage, but he did not close the door, and that was enough for me to remain hopeful. The more I stabilized, the clearer my reflections became. I understood that Thailand itself was not the problem. It is a beautiful country with good people. The issue was the mindset I brought with me. I had gone there expecting a new environment to cure deep emotional wounds. That thinking put me in a position where I ignored obvious signs and handed over control of my life to someone I barely knew. I depended on a romantic relationship to give me purpose. That was not fair to her, and it was harmful to me. I now spend a lot of time talking to other men who are considering moving overseas to start fresh. I tell them my story directly, without hiding anything, because I want them to understand the risks. I do not tell them to avoid Thailand. I tell them to avoid walking into a foreign country with unresolved emotional baggage. I tell them to protect their money, ask questions, keep documents, and never invest in someone else's dream unless they fully understand the consequences. I also warn them about the illusion that moving abroad automatically creates happiness. Life problems follow you. Loneliness follows you. Personal flaws follow you. When you move to a new country, those problems become louder because you lose the support systems that held you together. I wish someone had told me that in a way I truly understood. Maybe I would have made wiser choices. Looking back now, with more clarity than I have had in years, I understand how easily someone can lose themselves when they feel disconnected from their own life. I had spent so long pretending that I was fine, pretending that the divorce did not affect me, pretending that my relationships with my children did not matter, and pretending that I was content living alone. That pretending eventually became my normal routine. I convinced myself that escaping to another country was the solution, instead of facing the emotional problems I ignored for decades. Thailand did not break me. My own denial did. One thing I remind myself of frequently is that vulnerability does not always look like weakness. Vulnerability can disguise itself as optimism. It can disguise itself as a desire for adventure. It can disguise itself as a man trying to reinvent himself at an older age. When I told people I was moving to Chiang Mai, everyone said I was brave, spontaneous, and open-minded. No one recognized that I was actually running from feelings that were too painful to deal with at the time. I believed the compliments and used them to justify a decision I made out of desperation. That is why I share my story so openly now. It is too easy to get lost in illusions when you refuse to be honest with yourself. I now understand that relationships built on emotional dependence are more dangerous than relationships built on simple mistakes. I wanted Molly to be the answer to my loneliness, and that made me ignore everything that did not fit the picture I wanted to see. I overlooked her lack of involvement in the financial discussions. I overlooked her resistance to putting my name on any documents. I overlooked how quickly she accepted my help, but how rarely she involved me in decisions that affected both of us. These were not small details. These were direct warnings that I refused to acknowledge because I felt grateful for her attention. People often ask me if I blame her completely. The truth is more complicated. I think she made choices that were selfish and harmful, and I believe she knowingly used my desire for connection to her advantage. But I also think I created the perfect conditions for that to happen. I gave her control over my finances. I let her guide all the decisions. I made myself dependent on her approval. I ignored the advice of other expats because I did not want to accept that I could be fooled. I put myself on a path that had only one ending, and by the time I realized it, I was too deep to turn around. That is my responsibility. I also learned that isolation can distort your sense of reality. In Thailand, I drifted away from everyone who knew me. I talked only to people who reinforced the fantasy I wanted. When someone tried to advise me to slow down or protect my money, I judged them as negative or cynical. I thought I was experiencing something special, and that they just did not understand. In reality, they understood perfectly because many of them had already seen similar situations happen to others. I now understand that listening to people who have walked the path before you is one of the most important things anyone can do when living overseas. Rebuilding my life back in Australia required me to admit that I needed help. That was something I had avoided for most of my life. I used to believe that asking for help meant admitting failure. Now I realize that refusing to ask for help is what leads people into deeper failure. My daughter, who I had pushed away for years, became the person who saved me. She helped me recover my documents, restore my pension, and regain stability. She did this even though I had barely been present in her life. I think about that often. It taught me that family ties are not always erased by time. Sometimes they wait quietly for the moment when they can matter again. Once I settled into a safer and more structured life, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would never let loneliness decide my actions again. I promised that I would never invest money without understanding exactly where it was going. I promised that I would never hand over control of my life to someone I barely knew. I promised that I would not chase relationships to fill emotional gaps. These promises became the foundation for how I operate now. They keep me grounded, and they prevent me from repeating the same patterns. Today, I live quietly. I rent a small room, I cook simple meals, and I go for long walks every morning. I keep my phone on and answer messages when my children reach out. I maintain contact with my old friends instead of letting myself disappear again. I volunteer at the community garden because it gives me structure. My life today is not magical or exciting. It is stable, and I value that more than I ever valued excitement. I still think about Thailand sometimes. I think about the streets, the food, the warm weather, and the people who treated me kindly. I never blame the country for what happened. I blame the version of myself who went there with the wrong intentions. If someone asked me whether I would ever return, I would say yes, but only with a clear mind and only for a short visit. I would never return in search of a new life. I do not need a new life. I need to maintain the one I have now. I decided to share this entire story because I want people to understand that anyone can fall into the trap I fell into. You do not have to be naive. You do not have to be inexperienced. You just have to be lonely and looking for meaning in the wrong places. When you believe someone else will fix your emptiness, you hand them the power to destroy everything you have. So I am telling anyone who is listening, protect your money, protect your documents, protect your identity, protect your emotional stability. Do not hand your life to someone simply because they make you feel valued. Emotional comfort is not a substitute for trust and responsibility. If you want to move overseas, do it for the right reasons. Do it with a clear plan, not an emotional wound. Before I end this video, I want to speak directly to the viewers of the channel. Please subscribe. This channel is one of the few places where people speak honestly about their experiences instead of pretending that everything overseas is paradise. Subscribing helps more people access these warnings before they make irreversible decisions. It supports stories that can protect someone's future. If my story reaches even one person who needs to hear it, then sharing it was worth it. Subscribe and stay informed. It can genuinely save someone's life.